Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I don't know about you, but when I first started baking, I was so overwhelmed with everything that I needed to buy, from KitchenAid mixers to different baking sheets and all the ingredients. There was just so much to look at, and I felt super overwhelmed, and my wallet did as well. But when it comes down to it, and when you're baking, there's really just a small list of ingredients that you always need to have on hand. And I'm gonna break them down for you today and show you what I always have in my pantry and in my fridge, so that whenever the baking urge strikes, I'm ready to go. This is a pretty short list, but I'm gonna be going in detail about each ingredient, as well as different ways that I recommend keeping them in my pantry, different brands that I like, etc. So I really hope it will be an informative and helpful list for you. Without further ado, let's get into my ultimate baking pantry's essential guide. Alright, first up we've got the OG ingredient for baking, at least for me here in the United States. I know it's different elsewhere, but the ingredient that I use 80% of the time is all-purpose flour. And I like to keep this actually stored in a Tupperware container like this, just because it's really easy to scoop out of and then portion into my recipes. I just have backup that won't fit quite in here. All-purpose flour is featured in so many different recipes, whether it's cakes or muffins or breads, so I always make sure to have some on hand. When you are shopping at the store, make sure to understand that self-rising flour and all-purpose flour are not the same thing. Self-rising flour already has leaveners like baking soda or baking powder added to it, while all-purpose flour does not. So that's why you see in recipes that call for all-purpose flour that you have to add some type of leavener if you want to get that rise. So I always make sure to have all-purpose flour in my kitchen, but there are some other types of flours I recommend for more advanced recipes. For instance, you can get cake flour, which is good for cakes, obviously. You can also pick up bread flour, which is great for making things like breads because it has a higher protein content and develops more gluten. And finally, I also love having almond flour on hand, which I actually have some now because that's what you have to use to make certain items like macarons, and it's just great to have in general. Up next then we have granulated sugar, and I just keep mine in this big mason container. I think it's like a giant mason jar thing, and I have it labeled. Side note, but I'm obsessed with my label maker, and I'll leave it linked below. I went on a frenzy a few weeks ago labeling everything that I own, and I just love how vintage and old it looks. Anyways, back to why we're here. Granulated sugar is so important, and it's featured in so many different recipes. Sugar is important because it helps keep baked goods moist and also makes them more tender, which means extra deliciousness for us. And you're going to see it featured in almost every recipe, so always make sure to have some on hand. And like the flour I showed before, I like to keep it in a container like this just because it keeps it safe from getting any kind of bacteria or anything in it, but also it's super easy to take off and then just spoon into the recipe itself. So highly recommend getting a container like this. After granulated sugar, I probably use powdered sugar the most. And this is actually sometimes also called confectioner's sugar, but here in the US you can usually find it in a package like this, although spoiler alert, I always keep it stored in a container like this, like a Tupperware or a mason jar, just because this stuff will get everywhere when you're baking. So keeping it in an enclosed area like this that you can scoop out of is just a lot easier, trust me. You'll also see this sugar referred to as 10x, this particular version is, but you can also find like a 6x version or even more. That just means how finely it's been processed. Powdered sugar does have a tendency to clump, so I always make sure to sift it when I'm using it in a recipe, and you often use this to make like frostings or icing or different things like that. It's a lot of sugar, right? Up next we have some light brown sugar. So you'll oftentimes see recipes calling for brown sugar, and I usually opt for light brown sugar rather than dark. Brown sugar, in case you didn't know, actually gets its color from a little bit of molasses, and this really helps deepen the flavor of a recipe. So when you see a cookie recipe next time, try and see if it has granulated sugar or brown sugar, and you'll notice that using this rather than granulated will change the flavor of a recipe. Outside of baking, you can also use light brown sugar for marinades or sauces, so I find it really helpful just to have on hand at all times. Okay, I promise we're done with sugar for now. Let's move on to the other ingredient that I always have on hand and is just honestly included in almost every recipe you can find, and that's butter. So this is just the actual brand they had at my grocery store, but it doesn't really matter what kind you get. But I always opt for unsalted butter rather than salted. And that's because when I was first baking, I didn't really understand the difference or why it was important. But when you use salted butter, you can't really control the amount of salt in the recipe. So if you added kosher salt on top of it, it might end up tasting super, super salty. So when you use unsalted butter, you can easily control that amount. So that's why I always choose to use that if I can. So when it comes to butter, it's important to keep in mind that one stick is usually about half a cup, and it will have it labeled on there. So this comes with 4 sticks. So this will last me if I'm baking a ton, maybe a week. So I always pick this up whenever I go to the grocery store just to have on hand. Another essential ingredient for my fridge then is eggs. And eggs are so versatile. They're such an important ingredient to have, and they're always in my fridge. Not just for baking, but for general life as well. So when it comes to eggs, you can use the whites to make thick, fluffy meringues, and you can also use the yolks to make custards or even ice cream. So there's so many different uses for them, and even if I'm just using an egg white, I'll always save the yolk to have for a different recipe later. I usually fluctuate between buying white eggs or brown eggs, just depending on what's kind of on sale at my grocery store or what's available, but I usually always tend to buy the large version because they are a bit bigger, obviously, and usually better quality. So always make sure to have some eggs on hand in your fridge. Up next then we have the leaveners. And in case you missed it, I actually have a whole video on my channel describing the difference between baking soda and baking powder, so go watch that to learn more about that topic. But these are so essential when it comes to baking. So let's start with baking powder. Baking powder is a complete leavener, which means that it actually has baking soda and an acid inside of it. So when you're using it in a recipe, you only have to use it by itself. You don't need to add lemon juice or vinegar or anything like that. And as a chemical leavener, when you use this in a recipe, it's actually going to be releasing carbon dioxide and helps the baked good rise in the oven. So it's a super essential ingredient to have on hand, and most recipes will call for a leavener like this. On the other hand then, baking soda is an incomplete chemical leavener, so it's lacking that acid. So when you have a recipe that calls for this, you're going to have to add in something like vinegar or lemon juice like I mentioned before. This one is super common though, so you will want to have it on hand for recipes that require it. I also find that some recipes will call for a mixture of both baking powder and baking soda, so I do like to keep both of them at all times. Though it can get a bit expensive, vanilla extract is such an essential in my book when it comes to baking. When you're at the store though, make sure you're getting pure vanilla extract because you'll see lots of imitation vanilla extract, which is the clear version, and it is not worth it. Splurge for the better and pure version and you'll taste the difference in your recipe. Honestly, vanilla extract adds a delicious flavor to any recipe, and it also enhances the flavor of other ingredients as well. So it's really helpful to use. Leave it out at your own risk. And when I was working in a restaurant, we actually usually would use vanilla paste rather than vanilla extract. Oh my gosh, I forgot the word. Too much vanilla. So vanilla bean paste, I actually found this at Trader Joe's, which I was shocked by, is more of a viscous, thicker form, and it's really, really fun, and it actually leaves kind of that vanilla bean texture in the recipe. So this is an awesome alternative. It is a bit more expensive, so if you can find it, I would recommend, but use it a bit more sparingly. Now we're on to the best part, and that's chocolate. Whenever I say chocolate, I always think of that scene in SpongeBob when she's like, chocolate, chocolate.
Interest you in some chocolate?
Chocolate? Did you say chocolate?
Yes, sir. With or without nuts.
Chocolate? Chocolate! Chocolate!
So these are milk chocolate chips, and I usually keep a variation of this in my pantry to have for cookies or chocolate chip banana bread or anything in between, but you can also buy baker's chocolate, and this is usually more of the unsweetened variety. So in the baking aisle of the grocery store, you can usually find unsweetened or sweetened, so make sure to pay attention to what the recipe is calling for. And you can usually buy those in square form, so you can cut them up and use however much your recipe needs. But in general, I find that usually having chocolate chips or chocolate bars on hand will satisfy any recipe that I have. Apart from chocolate, then I always like to have some cocoa powder on hand, and I usually buy the unsweetened version because cocoa powder adds a delicious chocolatey flavor to everything from cakes to cookies, but by using the unsweetened type you can regulate the sweetness with other ingredients later. I also love to have cocoa powder for other recipes. You can use it for like hot chocolate or even a chocolate banana smoothie, and I have a great recipe for that, so I'll leave it linked down below. I drink that like every day. Up next, so cornstarch is an ingredient that you're not going to find in a lot of recipes, but it is a very hard ingredient to replace. So I always like to keep a tub of cornstarch in my pantry, and I'll use this pretty frequently, at least like once a week, because you can also use it for like savory recipes when you're like frying things. We use it to make a fried tofu, so it's really helpful there. In recipes, cornstarch works as a thickener and a binder, so when you add it in, you usually need to make a slurry by mixing the cornstarch with a little bit of water before adding it into a sauce to thicken it, for example. It's a really versatile ingredient and it is hard to replace, so just keep it in the back of your pantry for when the need arises. Okay, I can't get through this list without mentioning spices because in basically every recipe you find, you're going to find a need for some kind of spice, and they pack such a punch when it comes to adding flavor, so they're super essential in my book. They also last forever on your shelf, so it's really helpful to stock up on them and always have them on hand. Personally, some of my favorite spices that I love to use are cinnamon. I have both like the cinnamon sticks, which are good for a variety of things. Like if you're making some kind of like sauce or a compote, you can just dump this in to really get the flavor. I also have ground cinnamon that I use more frequently. Oh yeah, here's the ground cinnamon. Also things like having ground nutmeg or even having whole or ground allspice are great. Cloves, super helpful, and then also something like cream of tartar. Snickerdoodles and also my snickerdoodle scones that are so delicious call for cream of tartar, so I like to have this in my pantry at all times. Last but certainly not least, I love to always have honey in my pantry. This is a great option if you're making like a healthier alternative to a like traditional baking recipe because it adds sweetness to a particular recipe but not as much sugar. And I also love to use it for something like my oat milk matcha latte. I have a recipe for that, so I'll leave that linked in a card somewhere up here and down below. And it's great for just lots of other things as well, so always have this on hand. When it comes to honey as well, you can find lots of different versions. I find that the clover honey is pretty delicious and it's usually a bit more affordable, but you can find, usually like at the farmer's market, you can get wildflower honey and also in different flavors. At the restaurant I used to work at, we used to have the most delicious wildflower honey, so if you want to splurge, highly recommend picking something like that up. Okay, I think that's everything. I could go on and on when it comes to baking, but I'm gonna end it there just to save you your precious time. But I really hope you enjoyed hearing more of my baking pantry essentials guide. Like I said, these are just the ingredients that I always have on hand in my kitchen, and it makes baking so much easier. If you did enjoy this video, it really means a lot and supports the channel if you hit the like button down below. This just helps other people discover my channel as well. And if you want to stay tuned for more videos from me, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn the notification bell on as well. I share a new video every week, whether it's a new baking tip or a new recipe or everything in between, but you'll want to stay tuned for more. And I'm also sharing more behind the scenes content, new recipe ideas and things like that over on my Instagram, which is just the Baker's Almanac, and I'll leave that linked below as well. But for now, I think that's it. So thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy baking. Bye everyone!